Thank you all so much for coming, and I really, really mean that. I know I say this at the start of all these events, but democracy is participatory. And as a friend of mine said, one of the hardest things that happened in COVID was this recognition that our government really depends on transparency, and as much as we've tried to do things in person, it's just not the same online. I think this will be our 50th event in public, town hall meeting, but this will only be the second one since COVID. So we're trying to stay visible, but I appreciate you showing up. More than
microphone. I'm very hard of hearing.
Is it not? We do have is this not projecting through the, because I've got all these microphones that are on me right now, believe it or not. Let me just move it up, because maybe that's the problem. I don't know if that's any better. Sort of, maybe. You can hear me okay? I'll raise my voice a little bit, but I am mic'd. They're just these discrete ones. The second just observation I want to make is I have tremendous hope for the American people right now. On almost any issue, if you ask where people are, there's a lot more that we have in common that we have disputes. But I have a real concern for our democracy. There's this huge gap between, on any issue that you ask about, if you don't politicize the question, you find out that we've got a lot of agreement. When you politicize the question and you say, if you spin it this way, you might win your next election, we get all of this nonsense, and we get this through media outlets. We get this, my God, please never respond to the 15th comment on a Facebook page. It's the way towards darkness, right? But we have these divisions that are being exaggerated, and so, as much as what I actually do in my day job is primarily focused around legislation and things that are really important, around energy policy, really important. We spent a lot of last week focused on trying to address gamification of trading platforms in the wake of what happened to Alex Kearns in Naperville and what's happening with Robinhood. And I'm more than happy to talk about any of that in the questions, but I want to flag just a couple things in my introductory remarks about things that are purely factual. And if we have a shared set of facts, we can have wild disagreements about what we should do with those facts. But we've got to understand the shared set of facts. So I want to just touch on three quick things, try to do them quickly. First on the infrastructure package and what's going on in Congress with the trillions of dollars of spending we're trying to get through. Second, with what we are seeing in the state of the economy now. And third, on COVID and the Delta variant. Just factual, but I think it's important for us to understand these things. Let me start with the infrastructure package. You cannot understand what's going on right now without understanding some really weird Senate rules. And even within the Congress, that's a little bit opaque. We've been joking on our side of Capitol Hill that so much of this job right now consists of looking at the Senate parliamentarian and seeing if it's a puff of white smoke or black smoke coming out because of these strange rules. But let me just explain sort of what's going on. You got to understand the filibuster. The filibuster is a weird thing. It's not what our founders intended. And from a process perspective, me as a member of the House, the way that we decide what to vote on the floor is we propose a piece of legislation, we debate the piece of legislation, then somebody says, I'd like to call the previous question. This is a fancy word that basically means I want to stop debate. And then you call the previous question, and if the majority of the House votes to stop debate, you then vote on the bill, and if the majority votes on the bill, it passes. On the Senate, those are our rules. We make those rules in the House. We can change the rules. We can do whatever you want. Senate has our separate set of rules. They make their own rules. They can do whatever they want. The Senate, they call it cloture. It's like our previous question. But what the Senate says is not that you have to have a majority in order to stop debate. What they say is that anybody can decide that they do not want to debate a bill. And then, unless 60 senators say I disagree, the bill never comes up for a debate. If 60 senators agree, bill comes to the floor, gets debated. At the end of that debate, it passes with a straight majority. So the idea that the filibuster is something that requires supermajorities to pass laws in the Senate is not true. It's not even true that the filibuster requires a majority of people to vote to have debate. It's a negative protection. And Alexander Hamilton, I think Federalist, either 14 or 22, he had this great comment that he said, supermajorities create the problems they are designed to solve. because our founders had this idea that we should solve problems, the really hard problems, we should depend on the majority to make those decisions. And in fact, what the filibuster does is says we are going to depend on the minority to make those decisions. Now that's the reason that matters for the infrastructure package is because first of all, over the history of the Senate, our founders didn't create the filibuster. It was created really during Reconstruction in its modern form, primarily because there were people who were supportive of slavery, which was not a majority view, and wanted a tool to make sure that their minority viewpoints were ascendant. Over the course of the last 30 years, there's been a recognition by a lot of senators it's a problem. Senator Byrd, who held the seat that is now held by Senator Manchin, West Virginia, realized that there was a huge problem because the Congress, who has the power of the purse, would never actually be able to pass a budget on the filibuster. So the so-called Byrd rule says that it only takes a simple majority to vote for a budget, and if there are implementation issues on the budget, that's only a simple issue. So we've changed the filibuster there. Harry Reid, when he was the majority leader, observed all of Obama's judicial appointments being blocked and said, we're going to remove the filibuster for lower court judicial appointments, but not for the Supreme Court. So it was removed. Senator McConnell, when he became majority leader, said, I also would like the Supreme Court, and he removed the filibuster for Supreme Court justices. Some numbers here just for context. Justice Kagan got 63 votes to confirm her in the Senate. Justice Sotomayor got 68 votes. Justice Breyer, 87 votes. Justice Roberts, 78 votes. Since McConnell lowered the filibuster, Gorsuch got 54, Kavanaugh got 50, Amy Coney Barrett got 52. If we had not changed the filibuster rules, none of those three justices would be on the Supreme Court. So you got to understand, the filibuster is a completely imaginary thing. Why that matters now is that here we're talking about an infrastructure package that matters to all of us as Americans. What are we going to do for our highways, for our bridges, for our broadband, for our electric vehicle charging infrastructure, ports, airports, all of that stuff? We have passed a bill with that got a majority, the Senate. We still have to figure out what we're going to do in the House. But a whole host of things that could not clear the 60 vote threshold, but could have been done elsewhere, are now being done separately in this reconciliation package. And whether that works depends on whether the Senate parliamentarian, not an elected position, decides that that is consistent with a modification of the budget. This is not what our founders intended, right? So here we're sitting here now with this huge infrastructure bill. I'm not going to go into it, but if you have questions, please ask, and we'll go into lots of detail. But like I said, I just want to focus on the facts here. It's really important to understand that the majority of what we were going to spend on infrastructure, we have not even started debating yet. And we don't know whether that's going to clear the parliamentarians. So we're sitting there in the House saying, our process follows the way our founders intended, the majority rules, and we are waiting to see what happens in the Senate. So I mentioned that just to understand, level set the facts. As I said, you can decide what you want to do with those facts, but those are facts to be aware of, because you can't really understand what we're talking about with these trillions of dollars of spending without understanding that constraint. Second thing I want to mention, just level setting on facts, is where the economy is right now. We had, the basic headline is that the economy is doing much better than it was a year ago and is still a long way from where it was before COVID. A couple numbers, the jobs report that came out last week, we added almost 1 million jobs. The unemployment rate, this was in the last, what was that, August. Unemployment rate is down to 5.4%, was 5.9%. Pre-COVID, it was 3.5%. So we're still not back, but we're making, and by the way, in the depth of COVID, we were up over 9%. That number is a little bit misleading, because the unemployment rate is the number of people who don't have jobs divided by the number of people who are actively looking for jobs. The labor force participation rate is the percent of working age people who are currently looking for jobs. That's right now a little bit less than 62%. Pre-COVID, that was 63.3%. So we've lost almost 2% of the people who are eligible for work are not currently looking for jobs. And some of that is because of, a lot of that is because of childcare, because people who couldn't go back to work are now saying, I'm just not looking for a job right now. But if you assume that all of the people who wanted to work pre-COVID would still like to work, the unemployment rate is 2 to 3 points higher. That would also mean that the 9-10% unemployment we saw at the depth of COVID was actually at depression levels. 12, 13, 14%. These are really big numbers. These affect real people, but you got to understand those numbers. Earnings are up. Average hourly earnings went up 11 cents in the last report to a little over $30 an hour. So it's positive, but again, we're not quite back at the pre-COVID levels. Total unemployed people in the country right now, 8.7 million. Pre-COVID, that was 5.7 million. It's a lot less than it was 6 months ago, but again, we're not totally out of the woods yet. With respect to inflation, every economist we've talked to, including Chairman Powell, who we testifies before the Financial Services Committee that I sit on, has basically said very consistently that the inflation we're seeing in the economy right now is passing, transitory, and manageable. It's basically the result of taking an economy that was heavily based on service to one that was heavily based on consumption to going back to service. So a lot of these logistics and shipping delays, you're seeing the semiconductor delays, is because we've had a whole manufacturing economy based on just-in-time delivery that's bouncing back and forth. Almost a third of the inflation in the last quarterly report was driven just by used car prices. It was a 42% increase in the price of used cars. I had a friend who their car got off lease, and the dealer said, you actually have equity in your car. Which isn't supposed to happen on cars, but that's because of the semiconductor shortage. That will work out. The next biggest item was travel and leisure, because everybody, I suspect some of the people in this room, were excited to get out and travel again. So those things will ripple through. There's also, frankly, I think there's a general consensus among economists that a little bit of inflation would actually be a good thing, because the Federal Reserve has a mandate to keep interest rates manageable but non-zero, and inflation manageable but not excessive. And since the 2008 crisis, they've cut interest rates, inflation didn't go up. And so then they had to keep trying to figure out, how do I make sure, because people would like to get a little bit more money next year, right? That's inflation. How do you make sure that you've got sort of an acceptable level of inflation? And the result was the Fed purchased trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars of government securities to inject money into the economy. And so the Fed actually has a whole lot of very unconventional ammunition that they would love to unload, but they can't until they see inflation pick up a little bit. So yes, there's some transitory inflation, but it's working through it sectorally and will be managed. So and again, inflation is good if it means you get a raise. Inflation is bad if it means you can't afford to take a vacation. Beauty's in the eye of the beholder, right? So I'm not recommending a path here. I'm just saying it's important to understand those facts. Last thing I want to mention before opening up to your question is about COVID and the Delta variant. Everything that you think you know about COVID, you have to rethink it a bit with the Delta variant. And I'm going to get nerdy here, so bear with me, but this is important. Epidemiologists talk about, for any communicable disease, the average person who gets infected, how many people do they spread that disease to, right? It's called the R0 value. I won't use that word again, but what's that number? And for COVID a year ago, that number was somewhere between 2 and 3. If you got infected, you were going to give that disease to 2 or 3 other people. Now, simple math. If that number is less than 1, the disease is going to peter out. If it's more than 1, the disease is going to spread. That's the basics of the disease. There's then a second value, which is the one that we feel viscerally, which is what's the effective spread rate after we take whatever measures we can. And when President Biden said, I've got a goal to get 70% of the country vaccinated, if you think about what happens, if this disease is spreading, if the average person infects 3 people and 70% of the population is vaccinated, that means only 30% of the population is spreading something to 3 people. 30% of 3, you're getting down pretty close to 1, right? Now, it's actually not quite that high because the vaccine is not 100% effective, but for talking purposes, you can see that logic. And oh, by the way you get that all the way below 1 is by wearing masks. Thank you all for wearing masks. So we can do these things to slow the spread. And we were on a path to start slowing before the Delta variant emerged. The Delta variant has an R0 value of 8. Maybe a little higher, but that's sort of, it's much more communicable. It also, by the way, seems to affect kids much more. And the vaccines that we have appear to be almost as protective against Delta as they are against the initial vaccine. So the best thing you do is to get vaccinated. But now run the math again. If 70% of the population is vaccinated, 30% of 8, you're getting very close to the background level you had under Delta. So you simply cannot get Delta under control until we get vaccination rates that are much closer to 100%, and until then, make sure that we can wear masks. And this may seem simple, but I think the single greatest obligation, the single lowest obligation of any government is not kill people, right? And so that's what a lot of the dynamics here that are going through. And it's just worth understanding that, because you can't change that math, right? And so that's what we're all grappling with. And like I said, just what you think you knew, the instincts you had about what was appropriate, who can spread this, who was most at risk. There was just a heartbreaking story in the newspaper today that the Miami hospital, the pediatric center, is overflowing with kids getting COVID. We, quote unquote, knew that kids weren't that susceptible to COVID. The Delta variant's different. So, just keep that math front and center. Be thinking about that. Look out for your loved ones, because we don't want anybody to die who doesn't have to die. And at this point, we have the tools. Get vaccinated. Encourage your loved ones to get vaccinated. If you can't get vaccinated, for some medical reason or because you're not eligible left, wear a mask. So I hope that's helpful. Like I said, I just want to make sure that we're all working from a shared set of facts. And with that, I will stop talking and open up to answer any questions that you all have. And Laura, I guess we'll walk around with microphones to manage this. So just raise your hand if you've got a question, and we'll come to you.
Good morning or good afternoon, sir.
Hi.
I had been in contact with your office, and they were very kind and offered a response, but it wasn't informative. It was a response thanking me for asking the question. But it's in regards to the millions of people, based on the information I got from your office, that have not gotten their tax refunds from 2020. Now, I've been paying taxes over 50 years. I'm a veteran and a senior citizen, and I have never waited 140 days for a tax return in my life. I'd like some transparency. What is really going on?
Sure. So I wish I could tell you that your question was unique. The IRS is hugely backed up right now, and they are backed up in some ways because of COVID. And a part of what happened in COVID is that there are certain audit processes in the IRS that require custody of specific pieces of paper. And when the offices were less well staffed and they couldn't physically hand the piece of paper from here to here, that slowed the process down. They're starting to get through that, but that created a backlog. That is the smaller issue because that's solvable. The bigger issue is that our government has chronically underfunded the IRS, and to address that is sadly partisan. The Trump-appointed head of the IRS testified about a month ago that the gap between how much people owe in taxes to the federal government every year and how much we collect is $1 trillion a year. And so my colleagues on the Oversight Committee said, we'd like to fund infrastructure. The infrastructure spending is going to be over 10 years. If we could generate $1 trillion times 10, we could pay for a lot of infrastructure. And by the way, you don't have to raise anybody's taxes. You simply have to enforce the laws we have, as some people say. You simply have to fund the police, as some people say. We cannot get any support to do that, to the point that in the Senate bipartisan infrastructure package, one of the pay-fors was to provide that funding, and we couldn't get bipartisan support, so it got stripped out of there. So we're going to keep pushing, but what happens in the meantime is that the IRS, remember what I said about passing papers? They don't actually have enough computer space to digitize all of the tax records. In 2021, my goodness, they don't have the computer space. This is a chronic, and I would submit to you, very intentional desire to make sure that the IRS doesn't work. And we need to fix it, and I'm doing everything in my power to fix it. And I wish it wasn't so partisan to do so. And that doesn't answer your question because you're still stuck. But that's the cause of the delay, and there's, we in our office can certainly, rattle some chains and make some noise, and we've had some effectiveness, but this is a systemic problem within the IRS.
When does the fiscal year end for the federal government?
September.
I would think they'd want to fix that before September.
I would think we should have fixed it 10 years ago. Like these things still go through. So I take your point. No, I understand, but what I'm saying is it's difficult because there's only so many things you can do if it's purely partisan.
Done going forward.
Well, we will, frankly, this is one of the things that we're going to try to push when we have, back to my filibuster conversation, the things we can do with only 50 votes. We're going to try to make sure we get this funding to get them the resources so that they can do their job as well as they should. Next question.
You mentioned caregivers before, and I am a mom of young kids, but I'm also a former domestic caregiver. And there are more than 11 million of us in the United States, and we provide 15.3 billion hours of care, which is $257 billion worth of free care for our families and loved ones. In my case, I'm a member of the sandwich generation, which is growing, where my mom had early onset Alzheimer's, and I took on her care during maternity leave with my child, and had to balance child care, men's care, all of those things, baby proofing, on baby proofing for grandma because she can't get through baby gates. And I'm asking if you would support the Alzheimer's Care Support Act. It's a bill that will provide training, education, and relief for caregivers like myself who are overwhelmed.
So thank you for the question. I am familiar with it, and your broader question, you're absolutely right. Like for us to actually have an economy that's running on all cylinders, we need to not make sure that there are so many people who can't afford to work either because they're caring for, as you say, the sandwich generation, those too young to work or those who are in a position where they're too old to care for themselves. And it's a hugely important piece. The bill you're talking about, if memory serves, I think Senator Klobuchar had brought that in the Senate and didn't get to the House last term, and I think it's the one, correct me if I'm wrong, I think Maxine Waters is leading it. We serve on Financial Services Committee. She brought it to my attention last week. Our staff is meeting this week. I expect we'll get on, but we haven't made the final decision yet. So just waiting to sort of check the final boxes. But it's a critical issue, and thank you for raising it.
I was wondering if Democrats are going to try to change the filibuster, or have you just rolled over it and played dead?
Well, what's the Will Rogers line? I'm a Democrat. I don't belong to an organized party. There's a pretty wide difference of opinion on this within, among all elected officials, frankly. I personally led a letter of 100 of my House colleagues to Chuck Schumer asking to get rid of this because I think it stands in the way of good government. I think it's inconsistent with our founders, and the fact that I had 100 colleagues sign on to this tells you something about where at least 100 members of the House are, and there's a lot of members of the Senate who are there too. I think one of the things that is and at the risk of being sort of too much pop psychologizing, among the older generation of lawmakers who came up in an age when the prototypical Republican was a John McCain or a Bob Dole, and there was much more sort of comity. Among that generation, I think they'd like to get back to that, right, and not be at the point we have now, where members of Congress are live tweeting the location of the speaker when terrorists are attacking the House, right? We're in a different moment right now, and I think what you find is that sort of prioritization of comity above outcomes tends to be more likely among the people who have been in the body for longer periods of time. That's sort of how and that's not a Democrat or Republican issue. It sort of is the people who sort of learned their political skills in an era that's not quite the era that we're in today, think about it differently than folks like me who came up and say, look, I just came here to get stuff done, right? I can't imagine, as I was telling, some of you may have heard this story, I told some high school students recently, if you got a D on a group paper and you said to your parents, I did it with 2 nerds and 2 jocks, would your parents be happy or sad? Right? Like, judge us by our works, right? Not by how we got there. And I think that's an approach that's sort of more common among the younger generation of Washington, not necessarily by age, but younger by your sort of time in the body. than some of the older. And it's hard because we'd love to go back to that era when all of us said we are here for patriotic reasons. We want to do our service. We are extremely fortunate for some brief period of time to have this awesome responsibility, and I will respect the office above all else. That's not necessarily the moment that we're always in right now, sadly. So yes, there's a push. We'll see what happens. I think just before going to the end of that, I think there's, even among those members who are sort of on the fence but not over, there is a growing sort of quiet, I don't want to say consensus, but concern around voting rights. Because if we allow the will of the minority to consistently trample the will of the majority in the voting booth, that's a real problem. And so there is some talk around, is there, much as we've done limited carve-outs of the filibuster for judges, for budgets, for Supreme Court justices, is the right path to completely get rid of it, as I would advocate, because I don't think it makes any sense, or are there at least things to say where the practical effect of this is to frustrate the will of the majority of the American people? Can we find some carve-outs there? And I don't know, but that's some of the rumor mill.
Thank you, Mr. Noble, here. So this is me, and just given I'm a high-skilled immigrant, and I've been stuck in the backlog for almost 30 years. So just to give a context to Legitimize, the question I had, like, is waiting for his residence for 140 days. I've been waiting for my permanent residency for the last 30 years. And why I'm waiting for this? Because there's a discriminatory country cap. So if you're born in India, you get this much green card based on the country cap. If I'm born in any other country other than India, I have to be a citizen by now. So I did my master's here. During my master's, I had a few friends who were not born in India. They are citizens right now. I'm still waiting for my permanent residency. And there is the Eagles Act in the House, which is introduced by Congressman Lofton. And in the last town hall, Congressman mentioned that he will talk to Congressman Lofton about the recourse sponsor. So requesting Congressman to co-sponsor the bill.
Yep. So that bill, the Eagles Act, I think, is the Senate version. The Fairness for High-Skilled Immigrants Act that Congresswoman Lofgren did bring forward to address this issue was brought to the House floor. We passed it. I voted for it. We need the Senate to take it up. So we've done our part in the House, and we need the Senate to take it up. So that's the Fairness for High-Skilled Immigrants Act did pass the House.
Is this Congress named as Eagles Act?
No. So the Eagles Act is a Senate version. It's a Senate companion, but it's very similar. Well, I know we talked about this last time, and we'd be happy to follow up with you. But the piece that addresses the issues that you're talking about was in that Fairness for High-Skilled Immigrant Act, and we did vote and passed it on the floor. But I got to stress that, like, at the higher level, we have always, I think to our detriment, but it's always been the way since we've had an immigration policy, which was really since the 30s. We used to have like totally open, anybody could come here. Since we've done that, we have always had national origin quotas. Other countries haven't done that. Australia, Canada have said, what are the needs that our economy has, and how do we make sure that immigrants to the country match the skill sets that our economy needs? I personally think as a policy matter that's better, but we do still have, we haven't, neither of these bills address that fundamental question of, can we get more to a skills-based immigration system that matches to needs, as opposed to addressing the quotas? So it's a larger issue than just these bills, but that particular bill did pass the floor. What's our?
Support employment-based immigration having, a discrimination based on where I was born. Like my country didn't apply for a job.
Look, as I just said, I think the fact that we have always had country of origin-based quotas has always been a problem. And I say this as an employer, right? In my last life, we had a gentleman from Canada working for us as a project manager, and we had a gentleman from Ghana working with us as a project manager. They were both very qualified people. It was vastly easier for us to get the Canadian through the visa process than the Ghanaian. It had nothing to do with skills. It's a function of the way that we've done this historically. I don't like it. I've been as public as I can, but you got to pick your battles, right? And this is one where that's a lot to undo. So yes, I don't like it, we'll do what we can to support it, but on the Financial Services Committee, this doesn't come up. On the Science Committee, this doesn't come up. On the Climate Committee, this doesn't come up. So it's not, I'm not at a point where I can do much more than express my concern to my colleagues. Next question.
You said the lowest rung of government was not killing people. I wonder why you continue to support these occupations and continue to bomb countries and do military offensives. And you guys continue, like you said, you have the power of the purse. Why do you continue to fund these people? Like, why do you continue to give money to them? And it seems like amongst, me and people my age, is why are we continuing to support this as far as like why we're continuing to support this violence?
Do you have a
Not on American soil. We need to defend our country, but we don't need to be in these endless wars. I mean, I became a Democrat from the Bush era when they were recruiting kids my age to go fight. And 20 years later, now I have kids and I got to worry if they're going to get recruited to go fight somewhere. Like, it's embarrassing at this point.
Yeah.
Can you stop supporting these? Can you use the power of the purse to stop funding these people and their like bombs and violence, so we can give money to her and her mom and we can get him his tax return?
So we have voted in the House to lift the authorization to use military force that's specific to the Iraq War, and of course, with Biden now pulling out of Afghanistan, those particular ones that are the ones that you talked about from 20 years ago, which is the longest. Those are the longest authorizations to use military force we have ever authorized. It's about 4 times the length of the World War II authorization to use military force at this point. So we've voted for both of those in the House. I was proud to be a part of that and go lead them forward. I would point out, just to make sure that we understand the dynamics, and I say this as someone who voted for it, the most persuasive arguments I heard against it were from security experts who were basically, in a lot of words, saying that we are proving Colin Powell's theory. Remember when Colin Powell said the Pottery Barn theory of the Middle East, you break it, you own it? We did not like Saddam Hussein. He was a really bad dude. We broke what was there, and we destabilized a region. And I think there's a moral question that I think a lot of the national security experts grapple with of, having broke it, do we own it? And if you would have asked me, I wasn't in Congress, but if you would have asked me, do I think it's a good thing to get rid of Saddam Hussein? I probably would have said yes, but I would have assumed that the consequence of having a horrible, sadistic autocrat running that region would be better than anarchy. And if you look at the rise of ISIS, the rise of what's happened there, I'm not sure that that's true. So this was like the lesser of two evils. And so the challenge right now, and a lot of what our footprint is in that region, and frankly in some of the step down of Afghanistan, is we are in a global world, these things are connected, and having pulled out, what are the consequences? Because our military doesn't have an authorization to be there except through that AUMF. That's not the reason why the AUMF was issued, but essentially managing a lot of the terrorist threat in that region is going to become more complicated. And again, I supported it. I'm just saying that it's worth, I think, being aware of those arguments on the other side, which kept it in place longer than it should have been.
Hi. Good morning. Good afternoon. My name is Noam Sanjay, and I would like to extend my gratitude to you and your office for the guidance and help from your office. I'm happy to say that my son received his passport yesterday.
Oh, terrific.
Thank you for the work you're doing. Also had a question. What's the plan for immigration? Because there's been a backlog to especially foreign countries. I was just about Uganda, the one is not doing well. And it's been like almost 2 years I couldn't be able to get my work. I know your office has done a great job in communicating to me. And I was wondering, why can't they do like a court have day goes, people don't even show up in court. You just have time and date, and yeah, you're going to talk about that.
And sorry, when you say they, who are you referring to?
The immigration or embassies at immigration. Because right now,
Okay.
she's in Uganda.
Okay.
And she's supposed to be going to Kenya just for their visa, actually, but everything is approved.
Okay, so I will confess I don't know the answer to that question. I do think, though, in general, like, you know, if you look at like the courts that have gone to Zoom-based hearings, that took a while to roll out. In a lot of cases, they didn't have the resources to do that until we'd provided some of the local funding from Congress, because they didn't have budgets to do that. And the embassy funding would be a different pocket as well, right? And so even some of the courts, when the DuPage Courthouse has done a really good job at a very local level, different jurisdiction obviously, of building that out. But it took them a while to build it, and it was helpful for them that we had provided the resources so that they didn't have to steal that from some other budget. The embassies, I think, are a separate, different class of things that are not entirely under the jurisdiction of things that I have oversight over. So you're right, but I don't. I don't know off the top of my head exactly who would be the entity who would direct that, but we can find out and circle back with you through our office.
Congressman, when you first took office, you were talking about the acrimony between the Republicans and Democrats in Congress, and you sort of said, well, that's sort of overstated because you said you were able to get along with a lot of Republicans that work with them on bills. But given what's happened recently with the majority of the Republicans voting not to certify the election, have you changed your feelings about that? Because these people are effectively saying that, we're giving up on democracy. And I think it really would be hard to continue to work with those people and associate with them if they have that kind of position.
It is a truly hard question, because I think if in my answer to you, if I'm committed to not judging someone by the letter after their last name, that commitment is a two-way street, right? On the one hand, just because the letter after your last name doesn't mean I want you on my bill. On the other hand, just because the letter after your last name doesn't mean that I'm going to assume you're a good or bad person, right? And so, there's a lot of I think that's an easy rule to apply. And in general, I think the nature of our democracy is that if I disagree with you on absolutely everything, I still have to defend your right to vote, right? And so we could disagree on gun control, we can disagree on a woman's right to choose, we can disagree on climate change, but I can respect you as an individual because your opinion is no more right than mine, and our founders created this institution where the majority wins. For me personally, this is not a view shared by all my colleagues, but it's shared by a non-trivial number of them. That tolerance stops the minute you are voting to overturn our democracy, right? Because that vote on January 6th, for those people who voted to overturn the results of a free and fair election, was essentially saying, I do not respect your rights, Kasten, right? And I'm pretty comfortable with totalitarianism. And so for me, we've taken a decision in our office that we will not work with anybody this term. We won't sponsor bills with them. We won't vote on the floor for bills that are introduced by people who did that unless they've acknowledged the error of their ways. So for example, Tom Rice, who voted on January 6th, then after a moment's reflection voted to impeach Trump. And so Tom Rice I'm okay with, right? I mean, we all make mistakes and we move on from there. But for the folks who are still out there spreading this lie, I think the only way we have to hold them accountable is to say that at this point, our office is not going to work with you. And I wish it was a bigger number of my colleagues who felt that way, but there are a non-trivial number of us.
And just support the audit. That's all you have to do, transparency. All 50
The
your people won't let me answer a class.
no,
I'm going to go then. Okay,
no,
and then
no, no, sir,
Go. We hate you. Shut
sir, hey,
all 50, including your district, sir.
this is essentially the problem. This is why I said we have to lead with facts. 60 courts, 60 courts reviewed the results of the election, and they threw out every single claim. We had a free and fair election. We had overwhelming numbers of people who voted. The fact that there are people telling you it's not fair should scare you about the nature of our democracy. We don't need to audit. The audits have been done. We know we have a free and fair election. In our entire history, we have depended on the fair transfer of power. It's why people who lost elections, Al Gore could have made the case that there were Chads in Florida that weren't counted. But Al Gore understood that our country depends on the peaceful transfer of power. It is remarkable that our democracy has survived as long as it has, and it has survived because we elect people of character, and it has survived at core because the American people still consent to be governed. But I mean, think about, imagine that you were sitting there in 1789, crafting the Constitution, and you looked around at the forms of government you had, and you said there are governments where people use coercive force, and they simply force people to do things because they've got overwhelming might. There are governments where people say, you will do what I do because I am descended from gods. There are governments that say, you will do what I do because my bloodline is somehow superior to yours and only my descendants have the right to rule you. And those governments, as flawed as they were, had held up for hundreds and thousands of years in some cases. And our founders had this crazy idea that we would elect ordinary people who had no right, more right to govern than you or me, and their only power came from the fact that they won an election, and in the event that they won, all of us would consent to be governed. What Trump is playing with, what his supporters are playing with, is 245 years of experiment in democracy, because if they can convince the majority of the people not to consent to be governed, this democracy, this beautiful experiment is over. That is what they are playing with. It is deeply, deeply dangerous. That's why I have so little respect for the people on the House floor who saw what happened, who saw people attack the House, and said, I'm good with that. Shame on you. We do not need another audit. We've audited everything, back, front, left, center. 60 courts have decided. If somebody is telling you to the contrary, understand they are doing that because they hate our democracy. It frightens them that they might be governed by the will of the majority. Stand up to it. Be strong, because we're all better than that.
Congressman, in addition to everybody in this room, we do have a virtual town hall going on right now. So I have a question from Julian. Social Security and health care spending drive long-term debt growth, and their trust funds are going broke in the next few years. Should Congress fix them soon, or are you going to ignore the problem?
So there are a lot of discussions about that. John Larson is probably the strongest advocate for that, and if you really want to understand Social Security, it gets super, super complicated. I encourage you to pay attention to Mr. Larson. He's had a number of bills that he introduced last term, and they continue to work on it this term, that are really addressing, I think, the biggest core issue that largely solves most of this problem is that Social Security is this amazingly progressive system. And lowercase p progressive. Progressive in the sense that we say, we're going to make sure that people, when they hit a point in their life when they're more likely to be, in need than contributing, we're going to provide a safety net for them, and we're going to help them out. It is funded by an amazingly regressive tax structure. Because the way we fund this program is to say that it's only the first, and I forget it grows with inflation every year, but it's only the first roughly $140,000 of your income that's taxed to pay for Social Security. And so if you are Jeff Bezos, or if you are making $140,000 a year, you contribute the exact same dollar amount every year to the Social Security program. And that essentially largely creates the problem, right? And so most of the proposals that would go a long way toward solving this are basically things that say, let's take off that cap. We've got the current both your share in payroll tax and in your employer match. That stops at this 142,000-ish number. Let's take off that cap. Now, the latest proposals that I've heard, because President Biden has said that he doesn't want to raise taxes on anybody earning less than $400,000 a year, is that maybe we say we'll keep it we'll keep the $140,000 cap, but then we'll reinstitute the number if you're over $140,000 a year, and we'll gradually close that over time. There's ways to play with it, but it is a solvable problem that's created by the structure of the program and this progressive tax structure. So that's not the entirety of the answer, but I think that's the most thoughtful approach I've seen to address this.
Do you have to raise the maximum amount of money that you pay out to someone for Social Security?
Well, so there is, it's a good follow-up. Those are good here. It's what do you do about raising the amount of money that you pay out? There's a separate, much trickier issue. And if you go back and you look at the design of Social Security when FDR created it, all the rhetoric was around, we're going to have a three-legged stool for retirement. When you get to retirement, you're going to have whatever you saved in your life, whatever kind of pension your employer provided you with, and the Social Security system. And we now have a system where for a whole lot of people, the old days of defined benefit pensions are really gone for most people. There's a few places that still have them, but for the most part, if you have a retirement system, it's a 401k defined contribution. You've been exposed to more market volatility. That's, of course, if you were in the position to earn enough to contribute to a 401k, or you weren't someone in the gig economy that didn't get benefits. And so that leg of the stool has gotten much shorter. The savings, when FDR was doing this as part of the New Deal, there's actually a lot of parallels. Like that was the end of the Gilded Age, right? There was this tremendous wealth inequality that's close to what we see today. And a big part of what the New Deal did was start to close that wealth inequality a little bit so that you had people building up savings. You've now got huge numbers of people who have less than $1,000 in the bank account, right? So that level of the stool is gone. And what's hard now for Social Security is what do you do if this is a very wobbly stool, right? If it's a three-legged stool. And so there's talk about can we fix this by lowering the eligibility age down to 55. That increases the cost of the program, right? But if we step back and say, what do you need to retire with dignity? And we design this number with the expectation of two other legs on the stool. Either we have to figure out how to make those two legs higher, or acknowledge that we got to rethink the program. And that's a trickier issue, right? I mean, I can imagine ways to do it, but there's a lot of equities to think through on that.
Hi, I live in Palatine Township and I have a question about affordable housing. So in the township, there are about 4,000 families that live at or below, or households that live at or below the standard poverty line, but there are only about 400 housing units available for those families. And of the 7 buildings in the area, only one of them was financed by the low-income housing tax credit. The others predate that. And so it's been really difficult to build housing here. I think affordable housing partially because the construction costs are overinflated because of the tax credit, but also because of community opposition to affordable housing. In fact, one of the programs, one of the buildings was just withdrawn this week. It was a 3-story, 58-unit building. It was withdrawn because the community believes that building that building would be constructing a Cabrini Green, and they believe that it would be constructing a ghetto. So my question to you is there a mechanism to change the IRS rules to first of all address the overinflation of the construction costs, and then what can be done in the IRS rules to address community opposition? And then more broadly, what do you think it would take to legitimize housing as a social problem that's worthy of a serious policy response?
Man, that is a fantastic question. The only thing I can say dispositively is that using the tax code to change local politics is probably a bad idea. There's probably better tools. I don't have any great answers except to say that we've had so many meetings about this. If you didn't have a look, we did a whole town hall on affordable housing with Richard Rothstein, who wrote the book The Color of the Law, about how much of our housing policy has been intentionally racist, and you can't really separate those. You can't separate those causes. There's also, I don't know if it's still showing, but I would highly recommend the museum in Elmhurst, I'm familiar with it, has a whole exhibit on housing and how much that's affected the layout, the shape, and the color of the suburbs in Chicago. You have to kind of understand that history in order to know how to grapple with it. Because there is this subtext, right? When somebody says, I don't want green in Palatine, we understand what they're saying, right?
Right.
That has, I think where the tax code and some of the vouchers, like Section 8 housing that we've done, those can be effective to make housing affordable for people. And there's a number of proposals that we've talked about to expand Section 8 vouchers as an example. There's a fair amount in the Infrastructure Act. None of that really addresses the supply shortage. And at the root of all of the affordable housing questions is really the supply shortage. And there are things that can be done federally. A lot of it, though, is just having really just good local officials. The mayor of Glen Ellen is doing a really interesting project to go and bring affordable housing in. There's a really neat development, and somebody here will remind me of the name in Elgin. I'm forgetting the name of it. They did a really nice job of building out this facility in Elgin. It's an affordable housing complex, but you live there with dignity. If you drove by the place, you wouldn't know that it was affordable housing. It looks like sort of a nice condo development, but found a way to make this affordable and took advantage of some tax codes. And that happened not because the federal government directed it, but because you had good local people who were thinking about this issue and said, how do I make sure this happens? And how do I make sure that, in tens of thousands of meetings like this around the country, you're sort of walking through and saying, let's understand why this matters for our community. And I'll give just one more anecdote. In Downers Grove, where I live, the town has been really very intentional about recognizing that the cost of housing is rising faster than your income for first jobs. And here's this town that has thrived because it's attracted young families with school kids and brought good schools, and they're going to price themselves out. And so they're zoning. They've been very thoughtful, not tax-based affordable housing, but let's make sure that in the retail areas downtown, we've got some multi-use zoning. So there's affordable housing that's on top of the retail facility, and it's a little bit denser, and there's a place that you can come and live, and not have to drop $1 million on your first home, right? But have something that's, and so some of that is a zoning question. What do we do for minimum lot sizes? How do we do that? It's a lot of local questions. And I realize I'm ducking the question because I can do all these, and as I said at the start, I don't really know federally that there's one neat internet trick to make this go away. But we do have to recognize that at core, it's a question of supply. And solving the question of supply is a local politics conversation.
But also wages, right? Like if people had a minimum wage here of $25 an hour, they could afford the average price of an apartment here.
Yeah.
Yes, good afternoon, Congressman. Thank you for being here. As you know, voting rights across the country are under attack. While I understand that you are a member of the House, I was just wondering if you can comment on the status of negotiations behind the scenes in the Senate level regarding getting the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act passed and on Joe Biden's desk.
Excellent.
So let me take the two of those separately. The For the People Act is H.R. 1. The John Lewis Voting Rights Act will be H.R. 4. It actually doesn't exist yet. And I want to explain why it doesn't exist yet in a moment. But let's just take H.R. 1. H.R. 4 is done, this is the John Lewis Act, is done specifically to address the Shelby versus Holder decision. And under the Shelby versus Holder, this was a voting rights question. But under the Voting Rights Act, the federal government, elections are generally a matter of local law in this country. The Voting Rights Act said that when we can prove that you are intentionally discriminating and disenfranchising people based on the color of their skin, the federal government, under the provisions of the 14th Amendment, what have you, can step in and assert jurisdiction because you are violating federal law. Shelby versus Holder essentially gutted the Voting Rights Act by saying that the conditions under which the VRA was written were looking back to a time in history that was too long ago to still be relevant. And so H.R. 4 is to address how do we address what the Supreme Court has said, but do so in a legal, robust way. I want to come back to that. That's not going to affect the upcoming election because that affects what you do to go in and what sort of tools do you have after the crime has been committed. HR 1 is what you have to do right now. Like as a number of people have said, HR 1 is how you stop the fire from starting. HR 4 is how you put the fire out. HR 1 is a whole series of good government reforms, ethics reforms, so that members can't serve on corporate boards, campaign finance reforms, getting rid of gerrymandered districts, all really, really good stuff. We passed it in the House the last term. We passed it in the House this time. The Senate has not yet brought it up for a vote because it can't get through the filibuster. There is a rumored Manchin compromise that Mr. Manchin would be willing to support. I still don't think they have the votes, but they failed to get it past the filibuster last time. I think that my understanding is that the pieces that may end up on the cutting room floor in the Senate compromise version are mostly around campaign finance reform, which is sad. Although I will say that the specific provision is one that I think in hindsight we probably could stand to rethink. It's a provision that says that in the interest of making elected officials less dependent on the very wealthy, any donation you get from somebody of $200 or less will be matched 6-to-1 by the federal government. And so the idea is sort of you create a public financing for elections and you go from there. I think I think that provision will be gone in whatever comes out of the Senate. The reason why I think maybe that's okay is that if you look at the members of Congress who are really, really good at raising large volumes of national small dollar donations, they tend to be the people who say the most outlandish things to the media. Right? And so I think there is, since we first wrote the law, I think it's probably worth rethinking that. So I don't think it's the worst thing to rethink it. I think it would be tragic if we completely lost the idea that we should, in fact, have a clear public campaign finance system. I don't personally see a way that even that gets through without getting rid of the filibuster. And this was why I'd said, in response to one of the questions early on, that I think where there seems to be a consensus, even among the more recalcitrant senators, at least the ones in the middle of the filibuster, that if we're using this to block ourselves from having access to a government where the officials represent the will of the majority, then that's a problem. I would just leave you with one final, just sort of painfully funny observation that when we were talking about this at a caucus meeting, and Stacey Abrams had come to join us, and a lot of us, myself included, were getting pretty upset. Like, how are we not doing everything to prioritize this? And Stacey Abrams' comment was, "You seem to think that we have ever had a country where everybody had the free right to vote." Right? Keep in mind that Mississippi was majority black for a long time. They elected a black senator right after the Civil War. They haven't had one since. Right? Why is that? Right? And Stacey's comment was, it's not like you're going from 100 to 0, you're going from 53 to 49. Right? And that's sad and depressing, but as far as what your baseline is, it's worth understanding that we are the country where at the end of the Civil War, Ulysses S. Grant overwhelmingly won the South. Why? Because the South was overwhelmingly filled with voters who were deeply grateful for him making sure that they were free. And if it sounds weird that the South you think of as a place that's like in that place, it's because then Reconstruction came, the KKK came, and we have for a long time not had a free and fair election. Even in 2020, if you were a white person in this country, your average wait time for the whole place was 6 minutes. If you're black, your average wait time was 54 minutes. That's true everywhere in the country. It's true even if you drill down to counties. Fulton County, Georgia, white people in Fulton County 6 minutes, black people in Fulton County 54 minutes. It's true all over the place. And so there's, we still have had this very intentionally make it hard for certain, and I don't mean to say that this is all about race, but we have a long way to go to realize our founders' vision.
All right, I think we have time for one last question.
Are we doing anything to address the white dinosaur in the room, in terms of paying taxes? Like Jeff Bezos has his little trucks with the smiles on them on every street all day long, and he doesn't pay any income tax. He doesn't put back anything into the infrastructure that he's putting an unbelievable amount of wear and tear on. We have people who are the white dinosaur, who is taking all the money out, not putting anything else in, has the sense of entitlement that they're projecting onto everyone else, and if we have these rules that are set up to keep people from exercising their rights, and they're geared toward one demographic. And I want to know what's happening. Is that overarching picture being considered in the House?
Yeah, so a couple things. I have to first start with one of my favorite recent jokes that a billionaire, a working man, and an immigrant sit down at a table and there's 100 cookies. The billionaire takes 99 of the cookies, turns to the working man and says, "Keep going, an immigrant, you might take your cookie." This is the reality. So a couple things. We made our response to COVID way more difficult as a result of the 2017 tax cut. Dropping the top marginal corporate rates, dropping corporate tax rates. That was $1.5 trillion. 30% of all U.S. equities are owned by foreigners. So basically, that $1.5 trillion cost, almost 30% of it we just shipped overseas. It's hugely irresponsible, right? I didn't vote for it, but it passed through, and we've got to find a way to bring it back. There has been discussion, and again, this will not be in the bipartisan package because it's not very bipartisan to say this, but there will be discussion about going at least halfway back towards the corporate tax rates that were there before. I'd like to believe we should go further, but going at least halfway back. At the individual level, there are a lot of ways that if you are fantastically wealthy, you can reduce your taxes. I don't know if you saw the ProPublica argument, where they essentially say if you've got tremendous wealth, your income is taxable. But if you take your wealth and you borrow against your income to give yourself spending money, the interest is now tax deductible, and you can let your assets grow, but the asset growth isn't taxed, right? And there's a lot of tricks, and if anybody's a billionaire in this room, and I just helped you save a lot of money in your taxes, there you go. But there are a lot of these tricks. Those are harder to undo because to do that, you have to think about, we've always taxed income in this country, we've never taxed wealth. And whatever you think about sort of the Elizabeth Warren wealth taxes, that gets really hard, especially when you use like the agricultural sector, if your wealth is tied up in your land or your home, things that aren't easily monetizable. How do you structure that? The other big piece that I personally find fascinating, and I'm not on the tax committee, so I'm just sharing what I find interesting and what people are talking about, is there's been a global race to the bottom on taxes because we tax companies based on where they're domiciled. And it's very easy to shift your profits into a low tax jurisdiction. And keep in mind, you can't do this in the United States. So when I ran a company, we had operations in New York, Illinois, Massachusetts, California. We could not make, under U.S. tax codes, you can't move your taxable income in California to Illinois because it's a lower marginal tax rate and hide it. You have to reconcile all that, and there's no way to do that. There's no equivalent international standard. So if you go and you're a bank, and banks have actually done this, and you say, I'm going to take my headquarters, move it to the Cayman Islands, I'm going to loan my Illinois subsidiary money at 7%, and then the Illinois subsidiary is going to loan it out at 5%. It's all left pocket, right pocket, but I'm now moving my profits to a low tax jurisdiction and booking a loss in the United States. And a lot of what those countries have done is essentially to do that in offshore. The conversation going on in ways that I think we will end up paying for a significant chunk of the infrastructure spending is getting an agreement with our major trading partners for what's called GILTI, the Global Minimum Tax Level, where we basically get all the OECD countries to say we are going to categorically agree. You know, it's sort of like the NFL, like we're going to agree on a minimum rookie salary. Right? We're going to agree on a salary cap. We're going to agree that there's going to be a base tax that everybody has to pay. And that way we make sure that the companies who depend on our courts, who depend on our roads, who depend on our laws, who depend on our electricity system and our infrastructure have to participate in making sure that we have that, right? Because if you're sitting there and saying, one of the ideas that I've seen says you should just and I like the elegance of this, I'm not sure practically it works, But there are some discussions about saying that you should be charged, you should look at your total global profits and look at the percent of your total revenue that occurred in the United States, and then say you're going to pay that percent on that. You're going to pay that percent of your profits at that percent of your revenue. And so then you've got sort of a fairness to it. It turns out that it's actually really hard to make sure you can't pass that through, so there's some gaming issues, but that's the idea behind this stuff. So yes, it's a huge part of the Bayfor's infrastructure plan, and some combination of what I just told you will end up in that final package. Quick, I know we're about to end. A short follow-up on that, or?
Yeah, short follow-up. So we put these things in place. Who holds them accountable?
Well, notwithstanding my prior point that the IRS is underfunded, when you change tax rates, you do in fact change the amount of money that comes to the United States government. We do have some problems with collections, but we're not totally asleep at the switch, right? So yes, that will happen. Well, hey, thank you all so much. I really, really appreciate you coming. Please,